Hello everybody, my name is Rachel and welcome to my first reading wrap-up of 2021. It's actually been a couple of months since I sat down to do this. I'm now going to be doing these every 2 weeks, and to begin today I'm just going to go back about 2 weeks and talk about those things. So not everything that I've read so far this year, just the past 2 weeks. I feel a bit rusty and I know this is going to be long, so let's just dive straight into it. Let's start with the one book that I know I will be doing a separate review of, so I won't talk about it very much here, and that is The Angel of the Crows by Katherine Addison. This is Sherlock Holmes fanfiction. It's basically, transfer the Sherlock Holmes canon to a supernatural world where there are all manner of creatures, including angels, and the Sherlock Holmes character is a very likable angel named Crow. Yeah, this was a really enjoyable book. I read it very quickly, though I do have quibbles with it, and I will go into more of my thoughts on that in my review, which should be up in a couple of days. Another thoroughly entertaining book that I read was The Lefthanded Booksellers of London by Garth. This is, I think, billed as young adult fantasy, but to me it felt pretty much like an adult fantasy novel. This is set in a slightly alternate 1983, and it follows a young woman named Susan. She's been raised by her very vague mother who might have done too much LSD back in the 60s, somewhere out in like the country, and she decides to look for her father. She has no idea who her father is, but she has a couple of clues. So she goes to London to look for him, and in her first adventure there, she's pretty much attacked by supernatural forces and rescued by a young man named Merlin. He turns out to be a left-handed bookseller of London. So the booksellers, the very large branching family that Merlin belongs to, have pretty much been tasked with managing the magic of England for many generations. And the left-handed ones are pretty much the warriors, they do the groundwork, and then the right-handed ones, I think of them more like research librarians. So Merlin is left-handed, which means he's involved in a lot of the action and the fighting and stuff, and his twin sister Vivian is right-handed. And together, all three of them, Susan, Merlin, and Vivian, just go racing off from one place to another, looking for answers, wondering who Susan's father is, and if that is the reason that strange, mysterious people seem to be targeting her. And it was a lot of fun. I think my only criticism of this book is that it's a bit oddly paced. It's very frenetic. For the first 3/4 of the book, it's just running from one place to another and not a lot of answers. And then all of the answers and the conclusion and the wrapping up happens very quickly at the end. I wanted a little bit more. However, it was still fun. If this is the beginning of a series, then I am all in. I think there's so much potential in this world. The magic, the families, the characters, the relationships, what is going on with Susan's family in particular. There's a lot that could be told about them, and I would love to see the core cast going on more adventures together. This is also probably just a standalone. It certainly reads that way, but I think the way that it's paced and the way that it introduces the world would probably work better if it was the first in a series, so I'm crossing my fingers that hopefully it will be. Now for something completely different, I've been continuing on with the Ooku, the Inner Chambers series by Fumi Yoshinaga, and I recently read volume 5. I enjoy this, but I've hit a particular problem with the art style. So this series is basically looking at the history of a gender-flipped Tokugawa shogunate in an alternate history where most of the men in Japan have been killed by a plague. So the first couple of volumes of this manga series focused on the gender roles being flipped, how women had to step into positions of power because there simply weren't enough men. So it was really about gender roles and that dynamic in the first couple of volumes. And now onto the 5th, it settled down more into a historical retelling of gender-flipped shoguns and these powerful women and their trying to have heirs and not having a lot of success, and they have a very large harem of men. So there's a lot of drama happening, a lot of political intrigue and backstabbing happening in the inner chambers. So it's fun, but the problem that I've hit, particularly with this volume, is that there have been a number of characters introduced. We're now at a point where some of the original characters are now elderly or dying, and a whole host of new characters have been brought in, and they all look the same. Well, what did Rhea call this? Same face syndrome, I think is what they called it. It's definitely a problem here. I think the art style in this is good. It's not like amazing, but it's pretty good. But too many of the characters look the same. All of the female shoguns have the same face and the same hairstyles, and all of the men have the same faces as well. So I want to continue reading this because it's just fun. I mean, it's very dramatic. But I wish that there was more differentiating features of the characters, and I wish that there was an actual like cast list somewhere in like the back of the volume that I could look up people, but whatever. As I've said before, I will continue reading this series until I either lose interest or until I can no longer get them through interlibrary loan. So far, I've been getting them still, so we'll continue. Next up is Four Lost Cities by Annalee Newitz. This is a nonfiction book in which Newitz kind of explores 4 ancient cities that are often called lost and then found again, and they kind of extrapolate from what actually happened to those cities to what might happen to our modern day cities. Is it actually possible for a city to completely collapse and disappear and to be lost? And the answer to that, it was really interesting actually. It's not as cut and dried as you might think. It's not like things just completely collapse overnight and then you don't have a city anymore. So the cities discussed in this are Çatalhöyük in modern day Turkey, Pompeii, which everybody knows about, Angkor Wat in Cambodia, and then Cahokia in kind of the Midwest of the United States. So I had known vaguely or in some depth about all of these. I did, however, learn new things about all of them, even Pompeii, which I thought was pretty much tapped out. So it was a really interesting book. I listened to it on audio and it was a really fun listen, and it was just, it was really cool. I've been consuming a lot more like archaeological historical stuff, mainly through watching Time Team, and this was just like right up my alley at the moment. So yeah, I enjoyed it and I would recommend it if the topic interests you. Next, I read 3 novellas by Ursula K. Le Guin from this big omnibus called The Found and the Lost. So I did not read this entire 800-page tome. I just cherry-picked it for the stories that I hadn't read before or that I wanted to reread. So the first one that I read for the first time, surprisingly, was Vaster Than Empires and More Slow. This is an earlier Hainish novella, so it's set in the same kind of universe as things like The Left Hand of Darkness and The Dispossessed. And I didn't super love this one at first. So it's about a group of completely misfit scientists who go off to investigate other planets, and they land on this one planet which is really beautiful and peaceful but also kind of creepy, and then weird like psychological things start to happen. And I didn't particularly care for the characters, and I thought some of the mental stuff going on was pretty dated, but the way that it built up to that end I thought was pretty good. So not my favorite Hainish story at all, but I'm glad I finally read it. Then I reread one of my favorite Hainish novellas, which is Another Story or A Fisherman of the Inland Sea. I've read this one multiple times before in past years because it's been in other collections, and I just really, really enjoy it. It's about a young man who basically, he's telling the story of his life and how he was investigating like, I think Ansible technology and being able to like teleport pretty much, and he gets caught in a like time problem. So he's telling his story, which nobody else will ever remember, and I really like it. It's set on the same planet as some of her other Hainish stories that involve particular groups of people who have their marriages are really different. So that was just background material in this, but I was surprised I hadn't remembered that connection to the other stories. And then the third one, which I read for the first time, is not a Hainish novella. It's called Paradise is Lost, and it is about 2 young people who are friends, a woman and a man, who grew up on a generation ship, and things start to kind of go wrong with a religious sect on the ship, kind of this like cult that starts to take over the direction of the ship. and when they get to their destination, will they actually stop or not? This story reminded me so strongly of The Dazzle of Day by Molly Gloss, which is also about people on a generation ship approaching their destination. And I wasn't surprised at all. This was, I think, originally published in the collection The Birthday of the World. And in the introduction to that, when she's talking about the story, Le Guin specifically name checks The Dazzle of Day by Molly Gloss. So I was right. I thought this was interesting. It started to really interest me more by the halfway point. It's a pretty lengthy novella, and I was interested in what was going on and the conflict and the relationships between the characters, and then I felt like the ending was just not very satisfying. There's a bit of a time skip, and the antagonists in the story just disappear, and I was like, okay, that did not end in a way that really wrapped things up for me in a way that felt satisfying. So it was good, but I liked The Dazzle of Day better. So those are 3 novellas that I read by Le Guin recently, and I'll be reading some more in some other collections soon. I have been reading romance this year, and the most recent one that I read was Rafe by Rebekah Weatherspoon. The subtitle of this book is A Buff Male Nanny, which tells you everything you need to know about this piece of really good smutty fluff. So basically this follows a single mother named Sloane. She's trying to raise her twin girls while also dealing with her high-performing surgeon job. Her nanny quits abruptly and she needs to find a replacement, and she gets a lot of recommendations for this guy named Rafe. So she meets him and she hires him. He's really good with kids. He's over 6 feet tall, really buff, super tattooed, and they're totally into each other. Like, what is sexier than a guy who's really good with kids? I enjoyed this so much. There is basically zero angst. The characters end up communicating very well from the beginning. They jump into things, but they're not blind to what they're doing. And there is some conflict, a little bit of tension in the story, but it's external. It comes from outside of their relationship, and their reaction to that thing happening is to like come together and deal with it, which is exactly what I want. I'm also a little bit leery of reading stories like this that involve kids, but I think this was well done. The twin girls are about 6, I think, and they definitely added to the story. I thought they felt like kids, and actually seeing the adults interacting with them was good character development and explained a lot. So I loved this. I mean, it wasn't entirely perfect, but I loved it, and I want more zero angst stuff like this. I'll be trying other things by Weatherspoon in the future. Flipping back to science fiction now, I finally continued on with the Wormwood Trilogy by Tade Thompson. I read Rosewater a couple of years ago now, and I liked it. Didn't love the main character, but I liked the story and the world building. And I always meant to continue on, so I finally picked up the Rosewater Insurrection, which is book 2, and it was all right. Basically, this trilogy deals with this very strange, slow-moving alien invasion. I thought it was a little bit confusing what was actually happening in the first book. It mostly focused on the city of Rosewater and the mysterious alien dome that the town has been built up around. And in the second book, it becomes clearer what's actually going on with the aliens and what their agenda is, which I liked. It also focuses a lot more on some other characters that I liked more. Kato, who is the narrator of the first book, he does reappear, but he's just one of multiple points of view. So that solves some of my problems, but something about this book just didn't work for me. I don't know if it just felt a little bit like dum 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 and then something happened, and dum 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 and then something happened. It was a bit odd. I don't think it's necessarily a pacing thing, but I just felt like maybe what the problem is that there are a lot of characters and none of them are actually working together, and they don't necessarily communicate with each other that much. So the characters are constantly wondering whose side they're on, but only really being on their own side. There's no real concerted effort, and even when people are working together, they don't trust each other, and then they're betrayed, or things just change like complete 180 in the middle of them doing something important. And it was really frustrating. I was like, who do I actually care about in this case? Nobody's working together. Nobody can actually get anything done on their own. What is going on? I don't know. So interesting things did happen in it. I find this whole concept of the slow alien invasion in Nigeria to be really interesting. But something I think about the way that it's structured and the point of view characters and how none of them are really working together became a bit frustrating by the end. So I plan on finishing the series and hoping that the third book is better than this one, I guess. So yeah, we'll see. Flipping back to romance now, I read The Spectred Isle by KJ Charles. I have never done this before. I read this book in January because I just wanted to read more male historical romance by Charles, and this reminded me of her stuff that I've really enjoyed in the past. And then 30 days later, I reread it. I have never done this in my entire life, guys. I usually go years, like 5 to 10 years in between reads of a single book. But this one, no, I've already read it twice this year. It just really worked for me. So The Spectred Isle is from Charles's Green Man universe, but it hasn't, like, this series hasn't been continued since this book came out. I think the first series of stories in this world was the Casebook of Simon Fexemal, but I didn't even know that existed until after I had read this book. Anyway, it is set post World War I, I believe. I think it's set in like the 1920s in England, and not only has there been the actual war, but there's been what they call the war beneath, which was the occult war happening beneath everything. And it follows two men who both fought in the wars in their own way. One is Saul, who was a soldier, and he was discharged disgracefully. I think he was charged with treason because of something that happened with I don't want to spoil things, but something happened. So he's been utterly disgraced and disowned by his family. He had been training to be an archaeologist, but can't find work anywhere. And he ends up taking the only job he can possibly get with this kind of crackpot person, Major Peabody, who has a lot of supernatural occult theories, but has no idea what he's talking about. So he sends Saul running around England looking for supposedly magical sites. And Saul ends up running into, repeatedly, this guy named Randolph, who comes from a family for multiple generations entrenched in the magic of England. They are the caretakers of magic and certain magical sites in England. And Randolph is the only survivor of his family. Pretty much his entire family was wiped out in the war beneath. So he carries the weight of his entire family's legacy and their mission, pretty much. And they fall for each other, but also something terrible is happening in England and they're trying to stop this like evil spirit thing. I have not explained any of this well, but this may be the best fantasy romance I have ever read. The way that it's just combined. When I read it the first time, I read it very much like a fantasy novel that just happened to have a romance story thrown in. And then when I reread it, I was really watching for the development of the relationship between the two men and the hints and everything. So I read it much more like a romance the second time. It works either way. Like, if you're okay with some smutty male sex scenes, then go for it, you know? And I'm really sad that there is not a sequel. This would be a perfect set of characters and a perfect world for a series like Charles's Magpie Lord series, where you're following the same couple through multiple adventures. However, I suspect that if she ever comes back to this world, it will be focusing on different couples in each book, and I don't want that. I want more about Saul and Randolph. Anyway, the second book in the series has been delayed indefinitely for years, so I'm probably not getting any more of the Green Man universe for a long time. But maybe I will just come back and reread this book multiple times. Then I read two works by Nnedi Okorafor, which I enjoyed, but don't have a lot to say about them. The first is her newest novella, Remote Control. This one I found to be very sad. I think my reaction to it, when it ended, was more like, I really wished for better for the character, but yeah. So it follows a very young girl named Fatima. She eventually forgets her name and she calls herself Sankofa. And when she was a very small child, she encountered what I think is basically an alien artifact, this thing that she calls the seed, and it changes her. And then when it's lost and she kind of has this power within her, she's pursuing it. She's trying to recover the seed as it moves around, I think, Ghana. And she has the ability to kill people. She can just kind of like burn them up into ash. It's protective for her, but also she uses it sometimes to help people, to help them move on. So she is kind of revered, but also reviled. She's called the adopted daughter of death, and people know when Sankofa is coming. And, you know, she's pursuing this seed and she's looking for something, and she's had, you know, terrible tragedies. She's pretty much lost everything, including her own name. And yeah, that's it. It's like, it's her journey. And I thought it was kind of heartbreaking because all of this happens to such a young girl. You know, she's pretty much on the road, surviving by herself, traveling around and fending off attackers when she is like 8, 9 years old. And it's kind of unrelenting. But yeah, I think when I finished it, I mostly felt sad and I wondered what I was supposed to take away from it. I think it's one that I really need to reread, because when I was caught up in it, I was just trying to figure out what the character was doing, and then it was over and I was like, oh, did I miss something? So it was good, but deserves a reread. And then I read Okorafor's comic LaGuardia, which I think this won the Hugo Award a couple years ago. This was definitely inspired by the Muslim travel ban implemented by a certain administration in 2017 in the US. It follows a woman, an American-born Nigerian-American woman named Future. She's been working in Nigeria and she's pregnant, and she's basically smuggling a plant alien life through LaGuardia Airport into the United States. And there's this whole like ban on alien travelers from certain countries that presents problems. So it's definitely about the issues that Black people and immigrants face in, you know, with problems like travel bans and things. I liked it. I wish it had been a little bit longer, but yeah, it was quite enjoyable. I liked the characters. I enjoyed the artwork. In fact, I think that the main character Future actually looks a lot like Nnedi Okorafor, which I really enjoyed. So yeah, it was fun and it was about an important topic, so I liked it. And lastly, for this wrap up, I read Witch Hat Atelier Volume 2 by Kamome Shirahama, and I apologize if I butchered her name. It's a really sweet manga, basically. I kind of think of it as middle grade fantasy because most of the characters are very young. This follows a young girl who wants to be a witch so badly, but she's been taught that witches must be born, they can't be made. Then something happens and she ends up being whisked away to learn witchcraft with a group of other girls. And I think it's building up to this bigger plot line of like a really dark sect of witches are doing something evil and they have to fight against them or whatever. But for right now, it's still a bunch of setup and kind of establishing the world and the magic system and everything. And that's one thing that I really like about this. I don't think the plot is original in any way, which is a bit disappointing, but the artwork is stunning. It's so distinct, it's so different and really beautiful. And the magical system, which is expanded on even more in the second volume, is really interesting. It involves drawing things, and I really like the way that it's used in the story. So I'm going to continue reading this because it's good fun and the artwork is divine. You know, the characters, their designs and their clothing are really distinct and memorable, and I love that. The only downside to this is that the plot, the writing of it just isn't very original, so I'm hoping it will continue to keep my interest, and yeah, I'll continue getting it from Interlibrary Loan for as long as I can. And that is it. Those are all the things that I read in the past 2 weeks. It's a pretty good bunch of books. Let me know if you have also read any of these, or if you want to, leave me a comment down below, and I'll be back to talk to you again soon. And until then, bye.